Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well. We are continuing our discussion of the pre-Socratic philosophers. That's just what it sounds like, the philosophers who came before Socrates, right? This lecture is on Heraclitus. It's supposed to come after the lecture on the Milesians, so be sure to watch that first. And the next lecture is on Parmenides, right? So those three lectures, the Milesians, Heraclitus, Parmenides, they're supposed to cover the pre-Socratic philosophers for this course, which of course is Philosophy 3000, Ancient Greek Philosophy, okay? So all this stuff, these three lectures, you're supposed to watch them in the first week, and then next week we start on Socrates. We look at Plato's Apology. Okay? So, for now, Heraclitus, right? He was born around 540 BCE, before the Common Era, and that means he was born probably less than 100 years after Thales was born. Thales, of course, is the first Western philosopher that we're aware of, right? So philosophy is very young when Heraclitus comes along. He was born in Ephesus, and then Ephesus is about 40 miles north of Miletus, right? And so both Ephesus and Miletus are situated along the Ionian coast, right? Which is, in the modern day, that's the coast of Turkey, as we discussed in the last lecture, right? So in other words, Heraclitus was born not long after Thales in the grand scheme of things, and he was born near where Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, he was born near where they practiced philosophy, which is not surprising. All right, so it looks like, at least in the Western world, philosophy sprang up in Miletus, and then it just started moving around from there. It went north to Ephesus, and so on, spread throughout the Mediterranean world, because as we mentioned last time, the Greeks were busy colonizing the Mediterranean world, right? So just like I said last time, we're talking about people who are ethnically Greek. Are they related to people who now live in Turkey? If you look at their DNA, sure, probably. Just trying to explain that this is part of the larger Greek world. Just so you understand, this is connected to Socrates, right, through language and culture. What we're talking about here when we talk about Miletus and Ephesus are really Greek colonies. Okay, Heraclitus belonged to a royal family, right? So he was in line to inherit the throne in Ephesus. He didn't want to do it. He didn't want to rule. At least that's how the story goes, right? So he gave up his position to his brother and focused on philosophy. He was called the Obscure and the Riddler, right? Because what he says is kind of cryptic, right? Hopefully you've read through it by now. It's paradoxical. He likes to formulate paradoxes. He likes to put different thoughts in tension with each other, right? So he wrote this one book, as far as we know, just the one, called On Nature. And it's got this paradoxical tone, as I've said, and maybe it was aphoristic, but we're not sure. In other words, maybe it was made up of a lot of smaller, really tightly formulated, pithy interesting statements. Maybe the whole book was like that. We don't know that for sure. The parts we have are like that, right? And so a lot of people have thought, well, what we have represents what the book was like. So it was a lot of these tightly packed aphorisms, right? But maybe it was a flowing narrative work, and there were just little parts of it that were really punchy, and people sort of pulled them out and quoted from them because they were so punchy. We'll never know for sure. But it sure reads like a bunch of aphorisms. I mean, in a general sort of way, and I'm no Eastern scholar, in a general sort of way, it reads a lot like Eastern wisdom, right? And given that Heraclitus was living in Ephesus on the Ionian coast, it wouldn't be weird if he was heavily influenced by Eastern thought, but we don't know enough about him to know that that's the case, right? But if you look at his work and you look at something like the Tao Te Ching, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that very well, well-known Eastern work though, right? You could see some similarity in thought, and you could see a little bit of similarity in style, because the Tao Te Ching also has that punchiness about it. It's a lot of little sections. Okay, well, let's actually read some Heraclitus together, right? So first we want to read passages 1 and 2. That's how they're marked in our book. Start at the very beginning. That's a very good place to start, as Julie Andrews sings. Now, the Deals and Krantz numbers here. Now, remember, Deals and Krantz collected all these pre-Socratic fragments, and so we use their numbering system as a standard. So what we're looking at in the DK system is 22b1 and then b2. That's what passages 1 and 2 in our textbook are. Here's our textbook again. We showed it to you last lecture, right? Anyway, our editors have put these at the very beginning because they tell us what the Logos is. And remember, our editors have warned us, whatever the ordering is, we don't know. Like, whatever the correct ordering is, we don't know what order Heraclitus had these things in, because we don't have the book. And then when you put them in order, you impose some kind of interpretation on nature as a whole, right? So don't get too wedded to the ordering in the textbook. I mean, maybe you won't be able to help it because you haven't read other orderings of Heraclitus, but don't take it too seriously if possible, right? Anyway, let's read these passages. They're on page 20 in our textbook. Although this Logos holds always, humans prove unable to understand it, both before hearing it and when they have first heard it. For although all things come to be or happen in accordance with this Logos, humans are like the inexperienced when they experience such words and deeds as I set out, distinguishing each thing in accordance with its nature, or physis, and saying how it is. But other people fail to notice what they do when awake, just as they forget what they do while asleep. That's passage number 1 in the textbook, passage number 2 in the textbook. For this reason, it is necessary to follow what is common. But although the Logos is common, most people live as if they had their own private understanding. Okay, so what do I want you to get out of these passages? Well, the Logos is abstract. Things happen in accord with the Logos, but the Logos is not a thing and not a collection of things. It is necessary to follow what is common, says the second passage. But although the Logos is common, most people live as if they had their own private understanding. I believe as we keep reading, it becomes clear that the sensory world changes a lot, and Heraclitus wants to associate the sensory world with change and even with dreams. If we're hung up on the senses, we're asleep. We're not, in the sense that we're not really getting at reality. What's common is some kind of structure or pattern, right? And so that stays the same, even though the sensory stuff is changing. I think that's the picture that begins to emerge. It's already emerging in the passages we just read. And then when we read about the senses here and there, I think it becomes more clear. But you also have to think about what the word logos means, and that helps, right? So logos is obviously a key term here. So logos can just mean word, or it can mean account, or it can mean thing said, right? And then because it can mean those things, it can also mean sentence or proposition. It's a very rich word, so I'm going to keep going. Because it means account, like to give an account of something, kind of to give a definition, or more loosely to tell a story about it, right? You give an account, tell a story of what happened. Because it can mean account, it can be stretched to mean explanation or definition or theory. I'm trying to connect logos here to something as abstract as scientific law. I was working my way up toward that. So it's important to note that logos can mean ratio or pattern, right? So logos can have a very objective meaning, right? So if it's just a story, it can mean something that loose. That's not very objective. But it can mean definition, right? And then a definition could really nail the essence of something and tell you about the essence. So that could be very objective. Or if it meant pattern or ratio, right? You'd be talking about something that's really there. But it would, as Heraclitus is suggesting, it would be what's in common, right? The pattern repeats and the elements change. So pattern might be a good word for us to focus on. What Heraclitus is telling us is the world is really made of patterns. And so what we see with our senses is a bunch of different stuff. This after that, after this other thing. But there's a pattern to it. If we can grasp the pattern, we can see what's really going on, right? And so that makes the logos akin to scientific law. Like I said, Heraclitus seems to be, he doesn't have a lot of scientific laws to offer, but he's saying, let's go down that road. Let's try to find the commonalities. Let's try to find the patterns, right? If you really want to know what the world is, focus on the patterns, not the specific elements. I don't know if that came out clearly the first time, so I repeated it. Okay, so let's say a couple things to put all of that in context, especially with respect to the Milesians, who we've already discussed. So Heraclitus seems to be the first philosopher to focus on scientific law, to focus on something as abstract as that. It's definitely fair to say that all of the Milesians are material monists, right? Right. Each offers its own material substance as what the world really is. And then Heraclitus, I want to emphasize, is going in a different direction. He's not going to emphasize a specific material substance as what the world really is. Sometimes people look at Heraclitus and they get hung up on his comments about fire, right? And they want to use fire to connect him to Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes. I believe that's a mistake. We can talk more about the fire passages later. Heraclitus might be a material monist, and I don't have good grounds for denying that he is. But the Logos isn't a material thing. It's not a substance. It's more abstract than that, and he does want to emphasize it. I said the ordering of the passages was controversial, but the reason that these passages about the Logos are at the beginning, I mean, it's partly because our editors thought it was a good idea, so there's that. But also, they come from Sextus Empiricus, and he suggests that this is how Heraclitus begins his book. Right? So we do have reason to think that these passages actually came first. Most of the other passages, we wouldn't have any idea where they go really, but we think these came first. So it looks like Heraclitus comes out of the gate talking about Logos, not fire. And then it looks like Logos is a fairly abstract thing. Or maybe I shouldn't even say thing. It's fairly abstract. It's a fairly abstract entity, if you like, right? So I want to put a line between him and the Milesians. He might be a material monist. Maybe he thinks fire is what everything else is made of. I don't have good grounds for denying that. But he's not starting his book by talking about fire. That's not what he wants to emphasize. He wants to emphasize what's in common, but then what's in common, he says, is something like an account or a pattern or a ratio, rather than mentioning fire, which comes up later. It doesn't come up here at the beginning. Okay, so all things come to be in accord with the Logos, right? So things aren't made of the Logos. They come to be in accord with the Logos, as we've already read. So the Logos is an explanatory principle, as I've been saying, something like a scientific law. It explains the phenomena. It's not in the phenomena, but it's something that, if we grasp it, will explain the phenomena, like the law of gravity, it seems to me. That seems to be the sort of thing he's talking about. Okay, so like I said, if you're awake, then you can grasp what's in common, and you can grasp the Logos in particular. Heraclitus connects ignoring the Logos with being asleep. You're sort of asleep to reality. And I do want to read a passage in that vein here. So this is passage 19 on page 21, and the DK number is B89, if that helps. Heraclitus says, "For the waking there is one common world, but when asleep each person turns away to a private one." Right? So let's think about dreams a bit. Okay, so we've already got the idea that if you're awake, you're in the common world. If you're asleep, what's going on in your sleep that Heraclitus is trying to hone in on? Well, this sort of thing, right? And if you've studied Descartes, you're very familiar with this sort of idea. If you're in a dream, right, you can have an image of a chair, and then, when you wake up, you realize that was just a dream, that chair wasn't really there. But when you're dreaming, you take that image to be of reality. While you're asleep, your dream image of a chair you take to be an actual chair. So when you turn away from the common, which is the Logos, we've made that connection pretty tight by now. When you turn away from the common, you tend to misconstrue things. You tend to miss reality. You tend to think, oh, here's an image, that's what the real is, right? So again, if you're asleep, you have your own private sensory images to build on this same interpretation, and you think they're real, and so you're actually disconnected from reality in that kind of case. But of course, being asleep is just a sort of image here, right? You can be technically, literally awake, but also be asleep if you're not paying any attention to the Logos, right? Because then you're not living in the common, you're living in the private, the sensory, the merely sensory, right? That seems to be the sort of overall view that we're getting here. Okay, so again, the sensory world is changing all the time, right? And that's why we can't glean reality from it. So let's go ahead and get to the change stuff. We can look at this point about Hesiod first, and then we'll really get into what Heraclitus wants to mean, or what he actually means with his talk about change. All right, so what is this Hesiod thing I want to look at? Page 21, passage 7. So this would be B57 in the DK system. All right, anyway, Heraclitus says, most men's teacher is Hesiod. They are sure he knew most things, a man who could not recognize day and night, for they are one. In other words, Hesiod's a famous Greek poet. He's famous for the works of Days and Hands. He's famous for his genealogy of the gods, right? We still have some works by him, okay? So he never said anything about day and night being one. He treats them as separate things. He doesn't offer a theory of reality. He's a poet. He's not a metaphysician, right? So Heraclitus knows that Hesiod is well read. In other words, people around the Greek world read a lot of Hesiod, just as they read a lot of Homer, right? So the Greeks are enamored of the poets, and they think they're very wise. This will come up again later when we're talking about Socrates. But Hesiod was foolish in the sense that he didn't realize that day and night are one. Well, why was Hesiod so confused? Well, day and night look different. I mean, just to put it as straightforwardly as possible, day is bright, night is dark. Gosh, they look different, right? So, I mean, clearly Heraclitus is implying that day and night are one. What does he mean by that? Well, he means they help to explain each other, right? But Hesiod never said that, right? In other words, part of what constitutes day as day is that it succeeds the nighttime and is succeeded in turn by the nighttime, right? I mean, one way to think about that, I think there are different things going on here, but one way to think about that is things appear in contrast, or, to put it in a way that will become more salient later, things appear in tension with each other. Day sort of sticks out for us because, again, it comes after the night, and then the night will come again later. So there are things we might want to do when there's light, so we highlight in our minds this certain period of time when it's day. Okay, these are the things we can do at day, and then at night, it's more of a resting time. We can't do as many things. We can't see as well, right? So day comes to prominence in contrast with night, right? And if they weren't in this creative tension with each other, we wouldn't be able to pick either of them out as anything in particular, right? So that's partly epistemology, right? We wouldn't notice day if it weren't contrasted with night. But there is also a metaphysical issue here. Day really is something, partly because of what it's in tension with. So the way Heraclitus looks at it is there are a lot of these creative tensions that exist in the universe, right? This in strife with that, or this opposed to that. And because they're in tension, neither can completely take over, right? And so that allows them both to exist, and that allows some kind of pattern to emerge as well. There's an ordering to the way they succeed each other, right? So there are metaphysical issues here. We can put it in an epistemological way, right? Epistemology is the study of knowledge. So we can think about how we come to know day, how we know what it is, and the contrast with night helps. But also metaphysically, right? The tension between the two allows them both to endure, but in a patterned way. Heraclitus seems to be saying both of those things at the same time. Okay. So if you're as foolish as Hesiod, again, you just, here's this dark thing, here's this bright thing. They're totally different. They're opposites. I mean, that would be the common view. Well, they're just opposites. They're just completely different. Heraclitus is saying, no, they need each other. Each is defined by the other, right? And not just in our minds, but even metaphysically, looking at the deep structure of the universe, each is defining the other. Okay, so now we're ready for these river passages. So let's look at page 22 and look at passages 38, 39, and 40. We'll read them all together. And these are B12, B91, and B49A in the DK system, if you happen to be looking at that. Okay. So 38 in our textbook says, upon those who step into the same rivers, different and again different waters flow. Upon those who step into the same rivers, different and again different waters flow. I read it again so I could really emphasize the contrast. I already said Heraclitus likes paradox, right? And you can hear him presenting a paradox here. I want you to hear that tension. Passage 39. It is not possible to step twice into the same river. It scatters and again comes together and approaches and recedes. Passage 40. We step into and we do not step into the same rivers. We are and we are not. I really like that one, by the way. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, I mean, this is sort of a culmination, I think, of things we've been talking about, which is why I've waited until this point to read these passages. On the one hand, you look at the water and you focus on the water, and what do you see? Well, it rushes past. So if you focus on the material aspects of the world, the sensory aspects of the world, what do you see? You see flow, change, flux, right? Heraclitus is often said to embrace a doctrine of flux when it comes to the sensory world. Now, Heraclitus may never have used the word or the Greek equivalent of flux, but Plato used that word when he was talking about Heraclitus. So Heraclitus in the Western mind is forever associated with the doctrine of flux, and we're seeing that doctrine here. On the one hand, the waters keep flowing, but more generally, that is how the sensory world is. Everything changes and flows, and it's different from moment to moment, right? Your senses are giving you different information from moment to moment, okay? But obviously, there's another side to this. We step into and we do not step into the same rivers, according to passage 40. Upon those who step into the same rivers, different waters flow. So they're the same rivers, but there's different waters. That's passage 38, right? So the other side of the flow is something stays the same. And what is it? Well, it's the account. He's not giving us the account. Like I said, he's not giving us a bunch of scientific laws. He's not telling us the law of gravity. He is telling us we need to go in that direction. And this is early in human history, so don't think he's not being useful just because he didn't formulate a bunch of specific scientific laws. He's saying, look, in order to gain knowledge, we need to think about what's in common and not get hung up on the flow, right? So, how would you build on this? If you read Heraclitus and you were excited, and you thought he was right, how would you build on this? Well, you could at least point out that the source of the water is up there, it's coming out of this spring, or the sources of the water are this spring and that spring, and you could trace it all. You could figure out how high above sea level these various springs are, and you could figure out okay, well then how far down do the waters go, and how does that affect the speed at which the waters are flowing, right? There's a certain speed at which the waters replace themselves, right? If you're looking at a certain span of the river, it takes so much time for the water to be completely different in a given area, right? Can you connect that to where the sources of the river are, and to how steep the mountain is or the hills are, right? From those springs to where you are now, what's the incline? How much work? Not that Heraclitus has a theory of gravity, as we've already said, but how much work is gravity doing, or whatever the equivalent is for Heraclitus. He knows water goes downwards. he knows that much. So you might want to try to figure out, how much height does it take to get a certain speed, among the flowing waters? Or there might be other things you're interested in. I'm just trying to sort of give you some idea, right? He's not just a philosopher. He's interacting with the Milesians. They were all philosophers / scientists. I think Heraclitus is in the same category, even though he's not giving us specific scientific laws. He is emphasizing that we're not really going to understand the world if we just keep focusing on sensory stuff. We're going to have to go back behind the sensory stuff and figure out what the patterns are. Okay? I hope that's all helpful. Okay, let's look at a different passage now that I think will build on what we've been saying. Passage 44 on page 22. This is B30 in the Deals and Krantz system. So it says, this cosmos, the same for all, none of gods nor humans made, but it was always and is and shall be, an ever-living fire, kindled in measures and extinguished in measures. So I believe that gives the same picture, which is why I'm bringing it up. So I would suggest that you don't take fire too literally here, although it might be meant very literally. It's hard to say. We're definitely getting an image of a regulated exchange, right? And so fire is a good image for that, if nothing else, right? So fire is a regulated exchange, say, between wood on the one hand and then smoke and ash on the other hand, right? So in other words, there's some fixed rate at which wood becomes smoke and ash. It's regulated. You could do things to speed it up, but then you'd be doing things to speed it up. It's regulated. There are rules involved. So at least Heraclitus is saying that's what the cosmos is like. In some sense, it's always the same. It's eternal. No one made it. It always is. It always shall be. But it's also kindled in measures and extinguished in measures. So certain parts of the cosmos are disappearing, right, as other parts appear. But it's all regulated, right? So then the parts that disappear will reappear, it seems, or at least I believe taken in context, that's what the text suggests as a whole. I think the wording here does too, but to be really confident, you have to take it in context. It's like day and night. Sure, day disappears, but then it reappears later. I think the picture we're getting is that that's what the universe is like in general. Okay, so a more specific way to put this is the picture we're getting is unity in diversity. That's what the cosmos is like. There's a commonness, there's a pattern that emerges from the diversity. So it's university in diversity, or it's unity in the context of diversity. The unity emerges out of the regular exchanges, out of the diversity. right? I think that's the right way to look at it. Let's look at some other fire passages and see what role fire is really playing here. We'll try to get more clear on that. Okay, so passage 48 is relevant. This is B90 in the DK system. It's on page 22 in our textbook. 48 says, all things are in exchange for fire, and fire for all things, as goods for gold, and gold for goods. Okay. So fire can be exchanged for anything else. That sounds pretty literal. That sounds like something a Milesian might say, right? That makes you think, well, maybe this is the primary substance for Heraclitus. But there are other passages as well, right? And we need to take everything in context. So passage 77 on page 24 says, God is day and night, winter and summer, war and peace, satiety and hunger, but changes the way fire, when mingled with perfumes, is named according to the scent of each. Well, that's a very different, that gives a very different impression of what Heraclitus wants to say about fire. In that passage, fire really seems like an image. Right? God is. That's an interesting translation. I don't. Well, I'll give you a different translation in a minute here. Not everyone would use the word God there, but our translators are going with God is day and night, winter and summer, war and peace. So God is all these things, but not any one of them by itself. God is day and night. He's not day or night. He's day and night. He's war and peace, right? So the pattern, the regularity, the commonality, that's what's important. That's what's key. But God, or whatever the underlying principle of the universe is, changes the way that fire changes when you put different elements next to it. You can get different scents from it by burning different things, right? And you could burn some sage, right, and say, oh, I smell the sage. Well, you're smelling the sage burning is what you're smelling. That's the sort of thing that Heraclitus is saying here. You sometimes we name fires according to the different scents that are coming from the fire, right? But it's all fire, right? But it's clear here that that's an image. God is day and night. Fire is sage and myrrh. Not that I know much about what myrrh smells like, but myrrh comes up here in the book somewhere. What's a nice scent? I mean, I like cinnamon candles. Fire is sage and cinnamon. Something like that, just to give a more vivid idea of what he's talking about. Okay, so I want to say, on the one hand, I don't deny that fire might be the primary element for Heraclitus. So maybe he's very close to the Milesians and he thinks there's this single primary substance. But sometimes he's definitely using fire as an image because he thinks of fire as, something that interacts with different things and can change one thing into another thing. So it's a good image for the way the cosmos works as a whole. So here's a different book, The Collected Wisdom of Heraclitus, translated by Brooks Haxton. Right, so here's a different translation of passage 77, which is the same as DKB 67. Sorry, this gets complicated, I guess. But anyway, here's the same passage. By cosmic rule, as day yields night, so winter summer. War, peace, plenty, famine. All things change. Fire penetrates the lump of myrrh. There you go. There's a reference to myrrh. Fire penetrates the lump of myrrh until the joining bodies die and rise again in smoke called incense. Okay, that's a little more poetic than what we're getting from the text. Notice that God isn't mentioned. This passage starts with by cosmic rule. Right, so some kind of law. According to some kind of law that governs the whole cosmos, day yields night, winter yields summer, war yields peace, plenty yields famine. All things change, right? But in a regular way, in a way we can understand and grasp. And then, again, it's clear that fire is like an image here. It's like he's saying this is what things are like, and then he's saying, there's no as here. There's no as in the words that are being translated apparently. But it seems like you're being told literally how things are, and then you're being given an image. Oh, like how fire penetrates the lump of myrrh, right? And then that gets matter moving, changing, right? So a body dies, right? Other bodies appear. And you get a smoke called incense, right? So something is exchanged for something else in the fire. That seems to be an image of how, in the cosmos as a whole, day is exchanged for night, and winter is exchanged for summer, and so on. Okay. So now I want to focus on war and or strife. Heraclitus likes to mention war and strife. And yes, in case you're wondering, those are two different words in the Greek. The Greek words at issue are polemos, and I don't make any claim that I'm pronouncing that very well. Polemos, obviously related to the word polemical, and heres. Right, so war, polemos, strife, heres. All right, so Heraclitus likes these terms, and I've started to suggest why he likes them. This is part of his metaphysical picture. Although it sounds odd to say so, he thinks war and strife hold things together. There's some kind of creative tension at work in the universe. Okay, so let's look at passages 55 and 57 on page 23. These are B80 and B8 in the DK system. 55 says, "It is necessary to know that war is common and justice is strife, and that all things happen in accordance with strife and necessity." Passage 57. "What is opposed brings together. The finest harmony is composed of things at variance, and everything comes to be or occurs in accordance with strife." Okay, so this is related to the idea that the cosmos is really unity in diversity, but it builds on that, right? Where what's creating the diversity so that the unity can emerge? Well, different elements of the universe are in tension with each other. So war is common, right? Justice is strife, right? What exactly does that mean? The way things ought to be, it seems like he's saying, things get their due. Day gets its due, and night gets its due. D-U-E, by the way, is what I mean. Night emerges as much as it should, and day emerges as much as it should, because they're in strife. That seems to be the sort of thing Heraclitus is saying. Summer gets its due, and winter gets its due because they're in strife, because they're jostling, they're struggling, the heat wants to come, or the cold wants to come, and they rub up against each other, and they have a creative tension. And so everything gets its due because of the struggle. Heraclitus seems to be saying something like that. So you need war and strife. In other words, what? You'd have a dead universe, right? Because these tensions allow things to appear and succeed each other, and you get differences and diversity, and things are interesting. And too much heat would be bad, and too much cold would be bad, and too much light would be bad, and too much night would be bad. And we need these differences. They do different things for us. We do different things in the day than we do at night, and so these tensions are good. They're productive of good things, so they're good. All right, and then passage 59, also on page 23, says, they do not understand, these are the asleep people. They don't notice the Logos. They do not understand how, though at variance with itself, it agrees with itself. It is a backwards turning attunement like that of the bow and the lyre. Okay, I inserted a the. If you look at the footnotes here, right, there's no, backward stretching is another word we could use, right? So I'm trying to sort of give you a better image here. So the bow and the lyre, in other words, the bow has to be held in tension by the string that you use to pull. You pull back and you shoot the arrow with it. I don't know the right words for the string that strings the bow. There's probably a special technical term for that, but you know what I'm saying. The string holds the two ends of the bow together, right, so that everything is tight enough so that when you pull the string back, you get enough tension to shoot the arrow, right? So we're getting more of an idea of what tension is for, how tension is productive of good things. And then the lyre, like a little harp. The lyre is like a little harp. It is a similar thing. Well, you need the strings to hold the lyre together and make it tight. And then the fact that the frame of the lyre is pulling on the strings, right? It keeps them taut so that you get a good pitch, right? And then of course you have to manipulate the strings, maybe tighten them to get exactly the right pitch. But you need all that tension. That tension is productive of good things, a good pitch, good harmony, right? Because you're going to pluck a few strings at once and get a harmony going. You need the tension for that. You need the war. You need the strife. Okay, and then I want to look at Brooks Haxton again. So, let's see. So this is the same as passage 59, the last one that we read. This is Haxton's version of it. He says, the cosmos works by harmony of tensions like the lyre and the bow. Right? Not sure he translated the whole thing. He's a poet. He's doing things poetically. But I really like this translation, even if it's not the full thing. I think it's a good way to express what Heraclitus is trying to say. The cosmos works by. How does the cosmos really operate? Well, it works by harmony of tensions. There's a lot of strife and war, and it produces things. There are good outcomes as a result, just like the lyre and the bow, which are good images for us, the same way fire is a good image. Okay. So not too much left here. We have to fight to stay awake. Our tendency will be to sleep. It's easier. By the way, Descartes says things like this as well. There are things that are natural to us, and we naturally like the sensory. Plato also will say things like this. We like the sensory. We're excited by it. Our attention is likely to dwell on the sensory unless we struggle to stay awake, right? So we have to struggle, just like the universe has a creative struggle built into it. There are passages that suggest that sort of as a general rule, organisms do what's natural and easy to them. So let's look at a couple of those. I want to fit those into the bigger picture here. So on page 24, if you look at passages 68 and 69, Heraclitus says, pigs rejoice in mud more than in pure water. And we're inclined to look at that and say, how odd. I'd rather have the water. What Heraclitus, I think, wants you to focus on is, well, they do what's natural to them, and then you have to apply that to your own case. Well, what comes naturally to you? Probably focusing on the sensory because it's just more stimulating and fun, right? And then 69 is similar. I believe there's a similar point here. Asses would choose rubbish rather than gold. I mean, obviously there's a surface meaning, and you can just look at that and go, stupid asses, right? Don't have enough sense to go after the gold. But this isn't really about asses. This is about you, right? What are you hung up on? What are your bad choices and bad preferences? Can you figure that out? Can you work against it? Heraclitus thinks you're probably overly inclined toward the sensory, right? And so that's something you're going to have to work on if you want to get familiar with the Logos. You're going to have to work on yourself here to be a good scientist, right? So we're between philosophy and science, right? I don't think scientists in the contemporary world tend to say things like, if you want to be a good scientist, you better work on yourself and cultivate good virtues. That might be true. I'm not saying it's false. I'm saying that's not what scientists tend to say, right? I'm sure there are scientific virtues, and there probably are ways you need to work on yourself if you want to be a good scientist, but I never heard anything like that when I took a couple semesters of physics many, many years ago. Nobody ever mentioned anything like that. Same when I took a geology class. The geology instructor never mentioned working on myself and cultivating my virtues. But Heraclitus is saying that if you want to get a real picture of the world, work on yourself. You have some bad tendencies that you'll have to fix, right? And it's not, you don't need to feel bad about them. It's natural. Asses will choose rubbish over gold, and pigs want the mud more than they want pure water, and you like your senses more than you like your pure intellect. But, that's okay. That's just natural. That's how it goes. But if you want to get the logos and get a clear image of it, you'll have to work on that, right? Okay. One of the last things I want to say here is, as a recommended book for this course, I've got this book in the syllabus. It's recommended. It's called Ancient Philosophy, A Contemporary Introduction. The author is Christopher Shields. Okay, I'm going to invoke that book for a certain distinction here. Christopher Shields distinguishes between diachronic flux and synchronic flux. So, so far we've just talked about the flux, but Shields distinguishes these two different kinds of flux. So let's say something about that. So we've focused on diachronic flux, right? Because diachronic flux is the kind that emerges over time. So we were saying, we were talking about the rivers. Well, you get these waters at one time and different waters at a different time. So time is an issue there, right? Over time, the waters change, right? So that's diachronic flux for you. And then synchronic flux is difference at the same time, or there's some kind of diversity, but it's not because things are changing over time. So it's really a matter of perspective, right? You can look at the same thing in different ways and get different results because of the different perspective, right? So, for instance, we need an example. Passage 66 gives us a good example. Heraclitus says, the road up and the road down are one and the same, right? So you've got a road and it's inclined. You go, well, it doesn't have to be inclined, but that's one way to read this. You go up it one moment because of where you're trying to go. You go down it another moment because of where you're trying to go. And it feels different. You'd probably rather go downhill. But it's the same road. You're right. Your perspective on it changes. You see it differently at different times. But it's the very same road. So, yeah. So sometimes there's synchronic flux, right? And Heraclitus alludes to that. We could look at things one way or another. Something's the same. The road is the same. The incline is the same. But you have different goals at different times, and that changes your perspective. Like I said, it depends on where you're trying to go. But here's a different kind of example. Let's see. So this actually isn't in our textbook. It was in earlier editions of the same textbook. It doesn't appear in this one. They had their reasons for getting rid of it. But anyway, it's in the Brooks-Haxton book. And here's how he puts it. This is B82 in the DK system, by the way. So it is considered a quote, at least by Diels and Krantz. Here's how it goes. The ape apes find most beautiful looks apish to non-apes. I really like this one. So I had to read it even though it's not in our textbook. I'm going to read it again. The ape apes find most beautiful looks apish to non-apes. Right? So that, again, is synchronic flux. The ape is the same, right? But the standards of comparison change, so perspective changes. Some apes look at an ape and find the ape beautiful, and then the humans look at the same ape and they're like, it looks like an ape to me. I don't find that beautiful. But there's a commonality to it. There's something the perspectives are working around. So never ever think Heraclitus is a raving relativist or subjectivist. He always wants to emphasize what's common. The logos is what's common. In this specific passage, there's some particular ape that's common, or there's some particular road that's common. But just to be clear, Heraclitus is saying, yes, perspective makes things look different at different times, but you shouldn't trust your senses anyway. That is not his picture of reality. That's his picture of that's his picture of appearances, right? Appearances are subject to change and in flux. But reality is the same. The ape stays the same, at least in a given moment. The road stays the same, at least in a given moment. Something's always the same, and we want to figure out what that is. And then we know what's real. Okay? And that's Heraclitus in a nutshell. Okay, this has been fun. I hope it was helpful for you. Thanks.